Welcome to Moonlit Bonds from Dusk Chapters. Tonight's full-length story is the Salt-Moon Vow. Settle in, get comfortable, and enjoy. Chapter 1. The mortar was cold under Marin's palm, though she had been grinding since before the tallow candle burned to its second knuckle. Dried yarrow, feverfew, a pinch of the bitter black root that only grew where the cliff path crumbled toward the sea. She worked them to powder with a steady, patient rhythm her mother had taught her before the fever took her, and her grandmother's raspy breathing filled the small cottage like a second tide, pulling in, falling back, pausing sometimes so long that Marin's hands went still and her heart climbed into her throat until the next breath came. "I hear you thinking too loud, girl," came the thin voice from the bed in the corner. "Grind softer. You'll wake the gulls." "The gulls have better sense than to be up this late," Marin said, though she eased her grip on the pestle all the same. "Same as you ought to." Her grandmother's laugh was more air than sound, but it was there, a small dry rustle like wind through sea oats, and Marin held onto it the way she held onto most things now, carefully, as if it might slip through her fingers if she gripped it too hard. Old Rowan Larkspur had been failing since the frost came early last autumn, her lungs rattling louder each month, her hands curling smaller against the quilt. Marin fed her broth and bitter tinctures and the strongest herbs she knew, and still watched her grandmother grow thinner, like a candle guttering slow instead of being blown out all at once. Some things herbcraft could not mend. Marin tried not to think about that too often, especially at night, when the thinking had nowhere good to go. She measured a spoonful of the ground powder into a twist of cloth and set it with the others in the row along the shelf. 12 little bundles, one for each day until she would grind again, one for each day closer to the first of the month, when Harlan Bray, the harbor master, would come knocking with his ledger under his arm and his eyes doing sums behind them. Her mother's debt, not even her own, and still it sat on Marin's shoulders like a yoke. 5 years running now, ever since a Lowen Larkspur had died owing coin for a boat repair that had gone wrong in ways nobody in Thistlewick would quite explain to her daughter. Marin had asked, in the early grieving months, and gotten only sideways looks and murmured excuses, until she'd stopped asking and simply worked instead, mending nets, tending the sick, trading her herbs and her steady hands for whatever coin or goods she could, all of it funneled sooner or later into Bray's greedy palm. He never let her forget a season of it either, never let a full moon pass without reminding her, in that oily, patient voice of his, that a debt was a debt whether or not the borrower still drew breath. Marin set the pestle down and rubbed the heel of her hand against her eyes. Beyond the shuttered window, the sea was doing what it always did at this hour, drawing back down the black rocks with a long, hushed sigh and some old habit in her chest she could not have named when it started, only that it had always been there, as long as she could remember being a person in the world, reached for the sound the way another girl might reach for a blanket. She began to hum. It was not a song she had ever been taught, not a lullaby her mother had sung over a cradle, not a hymn from the little gray chapel at the top of the village lane. It had no words at all, only a low, warm thread of melody that rose and dipped like something breathing, and it came to her the way breathing came to her, without decision, without thought, only need. She hummed it when her hands ached from grinding. She hummed it when her grandmother's silences went on too long. She hummed it now, low under the rattle of the fire and the tick of the shutters, and felt the tightness and her shoulders loosen by degrees, the grief and the worry and the tired, gnawing fear of Bray's ledger all smoothing out beneath the tune like sand under a wave. She did not see, because the shutters were closed and the night was dark, and she had never once in her life thought to look, that beyond her window the withdrawing tide had gone still. It did not retreat. It did not advance. It simply held, black water lapping the same rock over and over, small foam-laced patterns repeating themselves at the high water mark as though time itself had caught on something and paused to listen. A fisherman out checking his lobster pots might have noticed, if any fisherman had been fool enough to be out checking pots at that hour instead of asleep by his own fire. But no one was out. No one saw. The sea waited alone at Maren Larkspur's window, and when at last her humming trailed off into a yawn and she rose to bank the fire for the night, the water let out a long breath of its own and went on retreating as if nothing at all had happened. Maren knew none of it. She only knew that the hum had done its quiet work, the way it always did, and that her hands had stopped trembling, and that when she looked over at her grandmother the old woman's eyes were open and shining faintly in the last of the firelight. "You used to sing that in your cradle," Rowan said, "before you could talk. I thought your mother taught it you, but she swore she never had." "Maybe I made it up," Maren said, tucking the blanket higher over her grandmother's thin shoulders. "Children hum nonsense. It doesn't mean anything." Rowan's gaze drifted toward the shuttered window, toward the sound of the sea beyond it, and for a moment something moved behind her clouded eyes that looked almost like memory, or like fear, though it was gone again before Maren could be sure.
"No."
"I don't suppose it does." Maren banked the coals and blew out the candle, and lay down on her narrow pallet by the hearth, listening to her grandmother's breath slow into the ragged rhythm of sleep. Through the gaps in the shutters came the ordinary sounds of Thistlewick at night, a dog barking somewhere up the lane, a loose shutter knocking against a neighbor's wall, and under it all, always, the endless conversation of the sea with the rocks below the cliff, advancing and retreating the way it had every night of her 22 years. She had grown up believing herself entirely a creature of this village, salt-cured and herb-stained, bound to its narrow lanes and its narrower opinions of her, the healer's granddaughter, Odd Alohan's odd daughter, the girl who hummed to herself and kept to the cliff path when other girls kept to the harbor gossip. She had never fit here, not truly, not since she was small enough to notice the way conversation stopped when she came too near, the way the older women crossed themselves faintly when she passed close to the Titteline at dusk. She told herself it did not matter. She had her grandmother, her herbs, her small steady work, and someday, when the debt was paid and Rowan no longer needed her hands through the night, she told herself she might yet see something of the world beyond the cliffs. A market town inland, perhaps, where no one knew her mother's name or her mother's debts. Somewhere she might simply be Maren, and nothing more complicated than that. It was a small dream, threadbare from years of careful folding, but she kept it the way she kept the 12 little bundles on the shelf, tucked away, waiting for whenever the day finally came that she was free to spend it. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying up from the rocks a mineral tang of storm not yet arrived, and somewhere far off toward the dark line of the sea cliffs beyond the village, past the old stand of pines the villagers called Wolfwood and crossed themselves to name, something with golden eyes lifted its head into the wind and went very still, as though it, too, had heard a thread of song it could not quite place, and did not yet know why it mattered. Maren slept, and did not dream of wolves at all, only, as she often did, of a tide that never seemed to leave her, no matter how far from the water she wandered in her sleep. Chapter 2. The storm came up out of the west just after midnight, the way sea storms always did in Thistlewick, with no more warning than a held breath, and then everything at once. Maren woke to rain lashing the shutters and the particular groan the cottage roof made when the wind got under its edges and tried to peel it back like a lid. She lay still a moment, listening for Rowan's breathing through the wall, steady and thin as a thread, before she rose to check the herbs she'd left drying on the sill. That was when she heard it, not the wind. Something beneath the wind, a low continuous sound like a bellows dragged over stone, coming from the direction of the garden. She told herself it was a fox at first, or one of the harbor cats grown bold in the weather. But foxes did not make that particular broken rhythm. 3 ragged breaths, and then a silence too long, then 3 more. Marin pulled her shawl over her nightdress, lit the lantern with hands that did not quite shake, and went out into the rain because there was, in the end, no other thing a healer's daughter could do when something was suffering within reach of her door. The garden was a wreck of flattened chamomile and toppled drying racks, and at first her lantern light found nothing but churned mud and the silver lines of rain slanting sideways. Then the light caught eyes. A wolf lay half among the ruined feverfew, enormous, gray as wet slate, its flank torn open in a long dark gash that the rain kept trying and failing to wash clean. It was easily as long as she was tall, its paws alone the size of both her hands together, and every instinct in her told her to run for the cottage and bar the door. But its eyes were the wrong eyes for that kind of fear, not the flat yellow glare of a cornered animal, but something aching and nearly human, fixed on her with an exhausted, pleading steadiness, as if it had crawled the whole way here on purpose, and was only now realizing it might have made a terrible miscalculation. "Easy," she heard herself say, the same low, even voice she used on frightened children and worse frightened old men. "Easy now. I won't hurt you." The wolf's chest heaved. Its lips drew back, not in a snarl but in something almost like pain, and then its whole enormous shape seemed to fold in on itself, bones sliding and reknitting with a sound like wet cloth wrung out, for drawing back into skin, until where the wolf had been there was a man. Marin did not scream. She would be faintly proud of that, later, when she had time to be anything at all. She only stood frozen in the rain with the lantern trembling in her fist while a naked, powerfully built stranger lay gasping in her ruined feverfew bed, one hand clamped over a wound in his side that bled between his fingers in dark ribbons the storm carried away into the mud. "Please," he managed, and his voice was a rasp, deep and rough as gravel dragged over rock. Don't call for anyone. Please." "I wasn't going to call for anyone," Marin said, which was true only because she could not, at that moment, have remembered how to form any other words. She set the lantern on the overturned rack, where its light steadied and threw the man's face into gold and shadow. He was younger than the voice had suggested, dark-haired, his jaw rough with several days' neglect, and his eyes, when he lifted them to her, were a color she had never seen on any creature that walked on 2 legs, a deep, warm gold, like late sun through amber, like the last light before the tide came all the way in. "You're bleeding into my garden," she said, because it was the only sensible thing left in her head, and because sense was the only rope she had to hold on to. "Can you stand? I have a table inside, better light. That wants stitching or it'll fester." "I heal fast," he said, though the words cost him visibly. "Faster then. Then this is showing you. Give me an hour and you'll bleed white in an hour, however fast you heal." She was already moving, some old, unshakable calm settling over her the way it always did once there was a wound in front of her and a use for her hands. She found an old feed sack blanket kept for the goat that no longer existed, wrapped it around his shoulders with brisk, impersonal hands, and did not let herself think too hard about the heat coming off his skin, more like a hearth than a man. "Can you walk?" He could, though it cost him. One arm braced hard over the wound, and she got him through her own door and onto the scrubbed table before Rowan's breathing on the other side of the wall so much as changed its rhythm. By lantern light the wound looked worse and better both. Deep, ragged, clearly some claw or blade, but already, impossibly, beginning to knit closed at its edges even as she watched, the way no ordinary hurt healed in ordinary men. "You're not going to ask what I am," he said, watching her thread a needle with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "I've spent 19 years mixing tinctures for a village that thinks the wind carries curses and salt cures a broken heart," Marin said. "I find I have room left over for one more strange thing before the night's through. Hold still." He held still. He held very still. In fact, with a fixed and faintly astonished attention, as though her hands moving methodically over the wound. Cleaning it with the vinegar wash she kept for exactly this, drawing the needle through skin that shuddered but did not flinch away, were the strangest and most remarkable thing that had happened to him all night, stranger even than the claws that had put the wound there. "Torin," he said abruptly, when she had drawn the first stitch tight. "That's my name. Since you're sewing me closed, it seemed only right you should have it." "Marin," she said, before she'd decided to give it. "Marin." He said it slowly, as though testing its weight, and something in his rough voice going gentle around the two syllables made warmth climb unbidden up the back of her neck. "Alpha of the Dusk pack. We keep the sea cliffs past the old pine stand. I don't imagine the village has kind names for us." "The village crosses itself at the mention of Wolfwood," Marin admitted, drawing the second stitch, "and hasn't got a kind name for much of anything it doesn't understand." She glanced up, meaning only to check the color returning to his face, and found his gold eyes already on hers, steady and unguarded in a way that made her fingers still over the wound. "What attacked you?" "A dispute," he said, "among my own, that I'd rather not trouble you with tonight." His jaw tightened, some private grief passing swift behind his eyes before he mastered it. "You're not afraid of me." "I'm terrified of you," Marin said honestly, tying off the stitch. "I've simply decided it can wait until you're not bleeding on my table." That surprised a low sound out of him, not quite a laugh, rough and startled and warm, and it was in reaching for the clean linen to bind the wound that her fingers brushed the bare skin of his side, just above where her stitches held. It was the smallest contact, barely a heartbeat's worth of touch, and yet something moved through her at it, low and sudden and humming, like a struck bell settling in her chest, like the tide finding its own rhythm again after being held too long against the shore. She went very still. Across the table, she saw him go still too, his breath catching audibly, gold eyes widening as though she had done something far stranger to him than stitch a wound. "You felt that," he said low. Not quite a question. Marin did not answer, because she did not have words yet for a thing she'd never felt before and could not, for the life of her, explain away. She only finished the binding with hands gone suddenly less steady than they had been all night, while outside the storm went on tearing at the shutters, indifferent, and somewhere beneath her ribs something that had always felt too large for her small salt-stunned life turned over once, quietly, like a key finding its lock. Chapter 3. The storm broke sometime before dawn, though Marin did not sleep to see it go. She sat with her grandmother's hand loose in hers until the old woman's breathing settled into its familiar rasping rhythm, and then she sat a while longer simply because her own mind would not settle at all. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt again that small, impossible current moving under her ribs, the warmth of it, the strangeness, and beneath the strangeness, something that felt almost like recognition, as though a door she hadn't known was shut had come, quietly, open. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of exhaustion and a long night, and too much fear held too tightly for too many hours. Wounded men said strange things. Frightened women imagined stranger ones. By the time gray light crept over the cliffs and found her still upright in her chair, or basket forgotten at her feet, She had constructed a dozen sensible explanations and believed not one of them. He did not come the next night, nor the one after. Marin noticed this the way she noticed the tide going out, not all at once, but as a steady, deepening absence that pulled at something in her chest whether she wished it to or not. She told herself she was glad of it. A wolf-shifter alpha bleeding into her garden in the dark was not the sort of complication a debt-bound healer with a dying grandmother and a harbormaster's ledger hanging over her head needed inviting into her life twice. She had enough to carry. She did not need to carry wondering, too. And yet at dusk on the third evening, she found herself standing at the low garden wall with a basket of comfrey she did not need to be cutting, eyes drifting again and again toward the tree line where the village gave way to darker, wilder country, the country the fisher folk called Wolfland in low voices and crossed themselves against, half in jest and half not. The sea wind combed through the sea thrift growing wild along the stones. Somewhere below, the tide murmured against the rocks in its old, unhurried voice. She told the emptiness at the tree line that she was only watching the weather, and the emptiness did not believe her any more than she believed herself. He came on the fourth night, and she was, despite everything, already at the window when he did. She heard him before she saw him. Not the great gray wolf this time, but a man's tread, careful and quiet on the garden path, boots avoiding the loose stone by the gate as though he had learned it on his last visit and remembered. When she opened the door, he stood just beyond the reach of her lamplight, tall and broad-shouldered in a dark traveling cloak, golden eyes catching the glow and holding it like a lantern of their own. He looked whole, healed, or healing well enough that only the careful set of his left side gave any sign he had been hurt at all. "You're standing on it wrong," she said, before she could think better of announcing herself with a scold. "The wound's still tender. I can see it in how you're holding yourself." Something flickered across his face, surprise, and beneath the surprise, unmistakably, pleasure. "Good evening to you too, healer." "Marin," she said. "You know my name. You may as well use it, since you've bled all over my kitchen table, and let me put a needle through you." "Marin," he said, and her name in his low voice did something unwise and pleasant to the pit of her stomach. He reached into his cloak and drew out a small leather pouch, heavy enough that she heard the coins shift inside it before he held it out to her. "For your trouble, and your thread, and your silence, though I hope I needn't ask twice for that." She looked at the pouch and did not take it. "I don't want your coin." "You should. It's good coin, and you stitched a wound most healers in this village would have run screaming from, once they'd seen what closed it." "I don't want it," she said again, more gently this time, "because I didn't help you for payment, Torin. I helped you because you were bleeding on my doorstep, and I am, whatever else I am, a healer first. Keep your silver for someone who needs convincing to hold their tongue." "I don't need convincing. I need—" She stopped because she had been about to say she needed nothing from him at all, and found the words would not come, not truthfully. "You need what?" he said, quiet, watching her with an attention that made her feel, not for the first time, entirely too visible. "Nothing," she said, too quickly, and stepped back from the door to let the lamplight fall differently, to give herself somewhere else to look. "Come in before the whole village sees a wolf lord's cloak on my step and starts talking. That I could do without." He came in, ducking his head beneath her low lintel out of old habit rather than necessity, and the small kitchen seemed to shrink further around his presence, warm and solid and faintly scented of pine and cold night air. He did not sit. He stood near the banked fire instead, turning his hat in his hands like a man who had rehearsed a dozen easy things to say and found all of them deserting him now that he was here. "The truth," he said finally, "is that I don't need your silence bought, because I trust you have it freely. And I don't need to bring you coin, because I have a steward who'd have carried it for me if that were truly my errand." He looked at her, and there was something almost sheepish in it, strange to see on a man built like a door frame with a voice like distant thunder. "I came because I wanted to see that you were well."
And because he stopped.
"Because," Marin prompted, when the silence had stretched long enough that the fire's small settling crack seemed loud in it. "Because since that night my wolf has not been easy in his own skin," Torin said slowly, as though each word cost him something to hand over. "He paces. He wants the sea air, wants it in a way he's never wanted anything that wasn't pack or territory or blood. And it took me 2 nights of not sleeping to understand that what he wants, Marin Larkspur, is you. Or near you. I'm not certain there's a difference to him." He gave a short laugh, rough at the edges, at himself more than at her. "I've led that pack 12 years. I did not expect, at 29, to be undone by a healer with steady hands and flower on her sleeve." Marin's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs, that same low hum stirring again, faint but unmistakable, like a struck bell she could feel more than hear. She thought of a dozen sensible things to say and discarded every one, because none of them were true, and something in her, something old and long buried under debt and duty and the careful, small shape she had folded her whole life into, did not want to lie to him. "I've been watching the tree line every evening since you left," she admitted instead, the words coming out low and a little startled at her own honesty. "Telling myself it was the weather I was watching. It was not the weather." His gold eyes found hers across the small room, and whatever had been guarded in his face eased, all at once, into something unguarded and warm. "No," he agreed softly. "I don't imagine it was." They stood like that a moment, the fire ticking low between them, the sea sighing its old patient sigh against the cliffs below, and neither of them moved to close the distance nor found any urgent reason to widen it. It was Marin who finally broke the quiet, because someone had to, and because if she stood in his gaze much longer, she thought she might do something reckless, like reach for his hand the way she had reached for the linen 4 nights past. "You should sit," she said, nodding at the bench by the fire. "If you're going to insist on visiting a healer in the dead of night, the least you can do is let her look at her stitching while you're here." Something in his shoulders loosened, gratitude and relief both, as though she had handed him a reason to stay that neither of them needed to examine too closely. "As the healer commands," he said, and settled onto the bench, and did not look away from her while she came to kneel beside him and drew back his shirt to check the wound beneath, her fingers steady now, though the hum beneath her ribs was not, and would not, she suspected, be steady again for a long while yet. Chapter 4. The message came at dusk, carried by a boy from the harbor who had no business running dusk-fong errands and clearly relished the danger of it, his eyes wide and his breath short when he pounded on Marin's door. "Torin sent word," he said, before she had even finished untying her apron. Torin sent word that she was needed, and would not say for what, only that it was urgent, and that she should bring whatever a healer brings when she does not know what she is walking into. Marin brought everything. She packed her satchel with willow bark and feverfew, with the tinctures she kept for fits and the salve she kept for burns, with clean linen and her mother's old bone needle, and she left her grandmother sleeping soundly, with a full cup of chamomile at her bedside and a promise, murmured to the darkened room, that she would be back before light. Then she went out into the blue hour where the cliffs met the shore, following the boy as far as the tree line, where he stopped and would not go further, and where Torin was waiting for her instead, alone, his face drawn in a way she had not seen since the night she'd first found him bleeding in her garden. "Thank you for coming," he said, and did not waste time on anything else, only took her hand, briefly, urgently, not the way he usually took it, and led her through the trees at a pace that made her satchel bang against her hip. The Dusk Fawn Lodge was not what she had imagined in the weeks since Torin had first come stumbling into her life. She had pictured something grim and secret, a den dug into rock. Instead, there was a long, low building of silver timber set into a clearing thick with moss, warm light spilling from its windows, and around it a scattering of smaller cabins tucked among the pines like chicks beneath a hen. But tonight there was no warmth in it. Tonight there was only sound, a keening, whimpering sound, half child and half animal, coming from within, and it made the hair rise on Marin's arms before she even reached the door. Inside, the lodge's great room had been cleared of its furniture and lined instead with pallets, and on the pallets lay perhaps a dozen forms, some human, some wolf, some caught in some dreadful state between the two, for patched over trembling skin, hands curled into something not quite paw and not quite fingers. A pup no older than 8 or 9 years human-side lay thrashing weakly in a woman's arms. His mother, Marin guessed, from the way she held him, from the tears cutting clean lines down a face gone gray with fear. Other wolves knelt among the pallets, murmuring, stroking damp fur back from glazed eyes, and none of them looked up as Marin entered. None of them had the leisure to be wary of her the way they might have been on any other night. It happens after the full tide, Torin said, low, at her shoulder. Has happened the last 3 moons running. Worse each time. They wake from the change disoriented, don't know their own names, don't know their mothers, can't find their way back to 2 legs for hours.
Some claw at themselves.
Some run, if we don't stop them, straight for the water, like something's calling them into it. His jaw worked. Tonight it took Idwen's boy. He's never been ill a day in his life. Marin was already moving, already kneeling beside the woman called Idwen, already reaching to press 2 fingers to the pup's throat where his pulse beat too fast beneath skin gone clammy and cold. He whimpered at her touch and turned his face away, and up close she could see his eyes were not right. Not glassy with fever, but wide and unseeing, fixed on something past her shoulder that was not there. How long has he been like this? She asked. Since moonset. Idwen's voice cracked. He should have shifted back an hour after. He always does. He always has. Marin checked him as she would check any patient. Pulse, breath, the heat of his skin, the clarity of his eyes, and found nothing a healer's training had ever taught her to name. No fever to break, no wound to bind, no poison she could purge with any tincture in her satchel. Only that terrible blank look, as though the boy's mind had wandered somewhere out past the tide line and not yet found its way home. I don't understand what's wrong with him, she admitted quietly, because there was no use pretending otherwise, not with a dozen lives suffering the same nameless thing around her. There's no wound, no poison I can find. Whatever this is, it isn't sickness the way I know sickness. Torin's silence behind her went on a beat too long, and when she turned to look at him, she saw something in his face crumple that she had not seen crumple before. Not even the night he'd dragged himself bleeding through her garden gate. Not even then, when his body had been torn open and his pride along with it. This was worse. This was a man deciding, in real time, to hand her something he had meant to keep buried. It isn't, he said. It's old magic, Marin. It's the moon curse. That's what Bevan calls it, and she'd know better than any of us. She's the last one old enough to remember when the sickness wasn't like this, when the tide moons came and went and left us whole. He drew a breath that shook only a little. I should have told you the first night you asked why I was so far from Duskfawn land in a storm. I let myself believe it was only a hurt I could hide from you a while longer. I'm ashamed it took this. His hand moved, helpless, toward the suffering room around them. to make me say it plainly. Something is wrong with my pack, and has been wrong for longer than I want to admit, and I don't know how to fight a thing I can't put a knife to. Marin rose slowly from beside the pallet, wiping her hands on her apron though there was nothing on them to wipe away, and looked at him. Really looked, past the alpha's straight shoulders and the careful stillness he wore like armor, to the fear underneath it, plain now that he'd let her see it. Pack law says outsiders don't come here, he went on, quieter still, as though saying it cost him. Says human eyes don't fall on us at our weakest, that no one beyond blood and bond should know what a dusk fawn looks like broken. I've held to that my whole life because my father held to it before me and his mother before him. But I am asking you to break it with me tonight because I have run out of anything else to ask. He met her eyes, and there was no pride left in it at all, only a plain and naked hope that frightened her more than the keening pup had. You feel things the rest of us don't, Marin. The tide listens to you when you don't even notice it listening. I don't know what that means, not yet. But I know I would rather set every tradition my pack has ever kept on the fire than watch children die of something I refuse to name because naming it frightens me. Is there anything in that healer's knowledge of yours that could reach a sickness rooted in magic and not in ordinary hurt? Because if there is, I am begging you for it. And if there isn't, I still needed you to know the truth before I asked you to help me look for one. The keening from the pallets rose and fell, like something answering a tide no one else could hear, and Marin stood very still in the middle of it, feeling the strange familiar hum beneath her own ribs stir as though in answer, and did not yet understand why. I don't know, she said at last, honestly, for it was the only thing she had to give him. I don't know if I can reach it, but I'll not turn away from trying. Not from this. She looked past him to the small suffering shapes on the pallets, to Idwen's stricken face, to the pup whose eyes had not yet found their way home. Tell me everything, Torin. From the beginning. Leave nothing out for my sake. I have buried enough of my own strangeness these last years to know what it costs to keep such things hidden. If the sea has some claim on your pack that I don't yet understand, then I mean to understand it, whatever that takes. Something eased in him then, some old weight set down if not lifted entirely, and he reached for her hand again. And this time she let him keep it. Chapter 5. The tree line at the edge of Dusk Fawn territory did not look like much of a boundary. No fence, no marker stone. Only a place where the birches of the ordinary would give way, almost without a seam, to older pines that grew close and dark and smelled of resin and cold earth. But Marin felt the change the moment she crossed it, a small shift in the air against her skin, as though she had stepped from one room of the world into another, and the door had shut soft and final behind her. You'll not be harmed, Torin said, walking just ahead of her on the narrow path, his voice pitched low the way a man's voice goes low in a place he loves and fears at once. But you'll be looked at. I'd have you ready for that. I've been looked at before, Marin said, thinking of the village women who drew their children close when she passed, of the harbor master's thin smile. I expect I can bear it. He glanced back at her, and something in his golden eyes softened, the way it had that first night in her garden, bleeding and unguarded. Not like this, he said. This will be worse, and it will be better. I only wanted you to know both are coming. She did not fully understand him until they came over the shoulder of the hill and down into a hollow where the Dusk Fawn Lodge stood, a long, low building of silvered timber with smoke unspooling from its chimney into the gray morning, and she saw the wolves. There were perhaps a dozen of them scattered about the clearing in various states of being, some four-legged and gray and brindle-coated, sunning themselves on the flat stones near the door, others fully human and going about ordinary tasks, mending nets, splitting wood, and a few caught between, not yet dressed in either shape, watching her from the shadow of the eaves with eyes too old and 2 gold for the young faces that held them. Every one of them went still when she came into the clearing at Torin's side. Every one of them looked. Maren had spent her whole life being the healer's daughter, the girl with the strange steady hands and the stranger eyes, the outsider even among her own kind. She knew what it was to be watched with suspicion. She had not known, until that moment, what it was to be watched by creatures who could smell fear on her before she had finished feeling it, and she made herself breathe slow and even, the way she breathed over a wound that frightened her and did not look away from any of them. "This is Maren," Torin said, to the clearing at large, in the voice she imagined he used to speak to his pack when he meant to be obeyed. "She has come to help our young ones. She is under my protection, and she will be treated as such." A murmur went through the gathered wolves, not quite words, more a shifting of weight and breath, and then a woman's voice, dry and cracking as old bark, said, "Protection. Is that the word for it now?" The wolves parted, unwillingly it seemed to Maren, the way water parts around a stone it resents, and an old woman came through them leaning on a staff of pale driftwood, wearing over her plain gray dress a shawl woven, Maren saw with a small shock, in a pattern of waves that any Thistlewick net mender would have known at a glance. Her hair was white and her back bent, but her eyes, when they fixed on Maren, were sharp and unclouded as a gull's, and there was nothing feeble in the way she crossed the last of the distance between them and stopped, studying Maren's face, as though reading something written there in a very small hand. "Bevand," Torin said, and there was a note in it Maren had not heard from him before, something between respect and bracing. "This is old Bevan, who was elder to my grandfather's grandfather's pack, and elder to mine. Bevan, this is Maren Larkspur, the village healer. She's agreed to help us, if there's help to be found." "Has she?" said Bevan, not taking her eyes from Maren. "And does she know what she's agreeing to?" "I know a sickness when I hear it crying on its pallet," Maren said, before Torin could answer for her. For something in the old woman's manner made her feel she ought to answer for herself, and be judged for the answer. "I don't yet know its cause. I've come to learn that, if your pack will let me look." For a long moment Bevan said nothing at all, only looked, and around them the wolves had gone very quiet, even the 4-legged ones with their ears pricked forward, and Maren felt the strange hum beneath her ribs stir the way it did sometimes at dusk, unbidden, and without deciding to she began, very softly, almost beneath hearing, to hum the old wordless tune her mother used to hum over the washtubs, the one that had steadied her through every hard night of her life, without her ever once wondering where it had come from. Old Bevan's staff struck the frozen ground, once, hard, and her face went the color of ash.
"Stop," she said.
"Stop that." Maren startled into silence, her cheeks flooding hot. "I'm sorry. I didn't know I was doing it. It's only a tune I've always known. I meant no. Where did you learn it?" Bevan's voice had dropped to something almost gentle, which frightened Maren far more than sharpness would have. The old woman took a step nearer, driftwood staff trembling faintly in her grip, and for the first time Maren saw, beneath the elder's fierce composure, something that looked uncomfortably like fear, or grief long buried and freshly disturbed. "Say true, girl. Where?" "My mother sang it," Maren said slowly. "Over the washtubs, over my cradle, so my grandmother says, though I don't remember that far back. I've sung it myself since I was small, without meaning to, when I'm frightened or when I'm working late. I never asked her where she had it from. I only thought it was hers." She hesitated. "She died when I was young. There's no one left to ask." Bevan looked at her for a long, long moment, and behind her the wolves had gone utterly silent, even the wind in the dark pines seeming to hold itself still, And when the old woman spoke again, her voice had lost its edge entirely, gone thin and strange, like something spoken across a great distance. "Your mother's name," she said. "What was it?" "Rosen," Marin said. "Rosen Larkspur. Though Larkspur was my grandmother's name, not my father's. I never knew my father." "Why does it matter?" "Bevan, please, you're frightening me, and I don't know why." But old Bevan only shook her head, slow, as though shaking off water, and turned to Torin with an expression Marin could not read at all, something caught between wonder and old sorrow. "Bring her inside," Bevan said. "Bring her to the fire, and bring the pups too, all that can be moved. And send someone for the boxes under my hearthstone, the sealed ones, that no one has opened since before you were whelped, Torin Duskfang." She looked back once more at Marin, and this time there was something almost tender in it, the way one might look at a door long thought lost that had, against all sense, opened again. "I do not yet know what you are, child," she said quietly, "but I begin to fear I know what your mother's mother's mother was, and if I am right, you have not come to us by chance, and neither did the wolf who dragged himself bleeding to your garden gate." Chapter 6. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Marin had not known she was hungry for until she had it, the way a starved thing does not always recognize its own hunger until food is set before it. Each evening, when the herb jars were capped and her grandmother settled into sleep with a fire banked low, Marin found her feet carrying her down the cliff path to the strip of pale sand where the dusk-fawn lands met the sea, and each evening, more often than not, Torin was already there waiting, his big shoulders dark against the last color in the sky. They did not call it anything. That was the unspoken understanding between them, fragile as new ice, that naming a thing gave it weight, and weight was the one thing neither of them could afford to carry just now, not with pups still waking wild-eyed from the tide moon's grip and old Bevan's sealed boxes sitting unopened beneath the hearthstone like a held breath. So instead they walked. They walked along the Titterline where the sand was hard and dark and held the shape of their footprints only until the next wave smoothed it away, and they talked, and somewhere in the talking the space between them narrowed by inches neither of them measured. "Tell me something you have never told anyone," Torin said one night, when the moon was a thin paring low over the water, and the wind smelled of kelp and coming rain. "A small thing. It does not have to be a wound." Marin considered this, walking with her shoes in her hand, and her skirt damp at the hem. "When I was 7, she said, I used to believe the sea was jealous of me, because I could walk on the sand, and it could only reach the sand and pull back again, over and over, and never keep any of it. I used to leave little offerings at the Titterline. Buttons. A ribbon once. I thought if I gave the sea small gifts it would stop being sad. Did it work?
No.
But my grandmother found the button jar half empty and thought I'd swallowed them, and I spent an entire miserable afternoon being made to drink vinegar water while she searched for signs of poisoning." Marin laughed, surprised at herself, at how easily the old embarrassment turned to warmth in the telling. "Your turn. Something small." Torin was quiet a moment, the kind of quiet she was learning meant he was choosing carefully among many things rather than searching for anything at all. "I was afraid of thunder," he said finally. "Not as a wolf. Wolves do not fear thunder the way you would think. It is only noise to the wolf, but as a boy in my skin, I used to cry at it, and my father would not let me be comforted for it. Alphas do not startle, he told me.
I learned to stop crying.
I did not learn to stop being afraid. I only learned to keep it where no one could see." "That sounds lonely," Marin said, before she could soften it into something safer. It was. He glanced sideways at her, and there was something unguarded in his face just then, gold eyes catching what little light the moon spared them. "It still would be, I think, if not for these walks." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and let the silence hold what words might have spoiled, and they walked on with the surf hissing white beside them and drawing back, hissing and drawing back, patient as breathing. It became a kind of ritual between them, the trading of small griefs like stones passed hand to hand, each one turned over and looked at, and then, somehow, made lighter by the looking. She told him about her mother's cough, the wet winter it had worsened, the morning she had woken to find the cottage too quiet, and had known before she rose from her pallet what the quiet meant. He told her about the brother he had lost to a rival pack's border dispute 2 summers before Marin had ever set foot past the tree line, a loss the pack still did not speak of by name, as though naming it might call the grief back fresh. She told him about the debt, the ledger the harbor master kept with her mother's signature at the bottom of it, the particular helplessness of owing money to a man who enjoyed the owing more than the money itself. He told her, haltingly, about the weight of being the one every wolf in Dusk Fawn looked to when the moon rose wrong, the fear that his own hands were not enough to hold his people together, a fear he had told no one, not Bevan, not even Cormac, who had stood at his shoulder since they were pups together. "You would tell me," Marin said, "before you would tell your own Veda." "I would tell you," Torrin agreed, "because you do not want anything from me except that I be well. Cormac wants me strong. Bevan wants me wise. You only want me not to be in pain. It is a rare thing, to be wanted for so little and so much at once." They had stopped walking by then, without either of them quite deciding to, at the place where the Titteline curved in beneath the black shoulder of the cliffs, and the sand narrowed to a private crescent hemmed by stone on 3 sides and sea on the 4th. Above them the rock face rose sheer and dripping with old rain, hung with dark sea ivy, and the sound of the water here was muffled and close, as though the cliffs had cupped the whole cove in 2 great hands to keep it safe from the wind. Marin looked up at him, and found he was already looking down at her, and something in his expression had gone very still, the way an animal goes still not from fear but from the effort of holding itself in check. "Torrin," she said, and did not know herself what she meant to follow it with. "I know," he said quietly. "I know what this is becoming. I am not fool enough to pretend I don't feel it, Marin. I have felt it since your hands were first on my wound, humming under my skin like your voice does even now when you are not singing at all. But I cannot name it. Not while Cormac watches for any weakness to call disloyalty. Not while there are pups in Bevan's care who cannot hold their own shape past moonrise. If I name this now, and the pack falls to ruin around us, I will have given you a broken thing and called it a gift." "I am not asking you to name it," Marin said, and found her voice had gone soft and low, matching the hush of the cove. "I am only asking you to be here. That is enough. That has always been enough." He reached up, slow enough that she could have stepped back and did not, and brushed a strand of wind-loosed hair from her cheek, his fingers rough and warm and careful, as though she were something that could bruise. "It should not be enough," he murmured. "You deserve to be shouted from the cliffs, Marin Larkspur, not kept in a cove where no one can see." "Then let this be mine," she whispered, "until it can be everyone's." He made a low sound, something between a laugh and a groan, as though she had undone the last thread of his restraint by giving him permission rather than asking him to break his own rule, and then he bent his head and kissed her, gently, so gently, his hand cupping her jaw as if the whole night depended on his not startling her away. She rose into it without thought, her fingers curling into the front of his shirt, and for one long, suspended moment there was no debt and no curse and no pack teetering on the edge of the moon's cruelty, only the taste of salt on his mouth and the warm, humming pulse settling deep and certain in her chest, singing its wordless answer to a question neither of them had dared to ask aloud. When at last they drew apart, neither moved far. Torin rested his forehead against hers, his breath unsteady, and the sea went on hushing itself against the sand behind them, patient, endless, keeping its own old counsel. "Quietly, then," he said, so low it was almost lost beneath the waves.
For now.
"Quietly in mine." Quietly, Maren agreed, and did not let go of him, and above them the thin moon climbed higher over the water, watching, waiting, holding its secrets a little while longer. Chapter 7. The morning after the kiss beneath the cliffs, Maren woke with her lips still faintly warm and her chest full of something she did not have a name for, and she told herself, quite firmly, that there was work to be done, and no time to lie abed mooning over an alpha wolf like a girl in a ballad. Her grandmother's cough had worsened in the night, a wet rattling thing that frightened Maren more than she let show, and so she rose before the light had fully climbed over the water and went to the chest at the foot of her mother's old bed, the one she rarely opened, searching for a particular dried root her mother used to swear by for chest ailments, something called bitter salt that grew only in the tide caves and that Maren had never troubled to learn to identify herself. The chest smelled of cedar and old salt, and beneath the folded shawls and the yellowed lace her mother had never worn to any occasion grand enough to deserve it, Maren's fingers found the false bottom quite by accident, a give in the wood where there should have been none. She sat back on her heels, heart quickening in a way that had nothing to do with wolves or kisses, and pried the thin board loose. Underneath lay a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and when she unwound it, a pendant slid into her palm, heavier than its size should have allowed, a disk of sea-green stone veined through with silver that caught what little lamplight there was and seemed, for a moment, to hold it, to swallow the glow and give it back brighter. Strange markings were etched into its face, spirals within spirals, like the pattern the tide left on wet sand at its furthest reach. Maren turned it over in her hand and felt, absurdly, the same warm hum she felt near Torin, fainter, older, but unmistakably kin to it, as though the stone recognized something in her blood and answered. Beneath the pendant was a book, its leather cover soft with handling, its pages filled with her mother's careful, slanting hand, and older still beneath that, a script gone brown and formal that Maren recognized after a moment as her great-grandmother's, the woman whose name was rarely spoken in the cottage, the one who was said to have come down from the north with nothing but a trunk and a silence about her past that no one in Thistlewick had ever managed to crack. Maren carried the book to the window, where the gray morning light was strongest, and began to read, and the world she thought she knew quietly rearranged itself around her. Her great-grandmother, the journal said, had been born to a line of women who kept the old vow, the tide witches of the northern coast, whose blood ran thin with salt and memory, and who had, for as long as anyone could reckon, sung the sea back from its worst grief every generation at the turning of the highest tide moon. In exchange, the sea had kept faith with a pack of wolves who ranged those same cliffs, ancestors, the journal said plainly, of the very dusk-fawn line that now made its home above Thistlewick, and the wolves in turn had sheltered and honored the tide witch women as something between kin and holy charge. It was, her great-grandmother had written in a hand grown shaky toward the end of the entry, a bargain older than any village, older than any pack's memory of itself, a promise of balance between the wolves' moon-blood and the sea's old hunger, and the tide witch's voice was the thread that held the two forces from tearing at each other. But her great-grandmother had wanted, more than anything, an ordinary life. She had fallen in love with a man who was neither wolf nor witch, a fisherman from a southern port, and rather than bind her children to a duty she had come to resent, she had fled in the night, taking the pendant with her because she could not bear to leave it and could not bear, either, to use it again. She had gone south, married her fisherman, and never sung the old song again, not even. The journal noted with a grief that reached across the years and pressed cold fingers to Marin's heart when her own daughter began to hum it unknowingly in her cradle, the way infants hum the shapes of things they cannot yet understand. Marin's mother's handwriting picked up where the elder woman's left off, sparser, more guarded, as though she had inherited the silence along with the blood. She wrote only a little of the vow, mostly warnings to herself never to sing the tune where anyone from the old country might hear it, and a single aching line near the last pages. Asterisk, if Marin ever hums it, do not let her sing the words. I do not know what it would call. I am too much a coward to find out, and I have made her a coward too, by saying nothing. Asterisk. Marin sat a long while with the book open on her knees and the pendant cooling in her palm, and did not know whether to weep for her mother's fear or her own inheritance, and in the end did both, quietly, while the sea outside her window went on with its patient hushing, utterly unconcerned with the smallness of human grief, as it always was, and yet, she thought now, perhaps it was not unconcerned at all. Perhaps it had been waiting. She went to old Bevan before she went to Torin, because some instinct in her, new and sure, told her the elder wolf would not flinch from the truth the way a younger heart, even one so steady as Torin's, might. She found Bevan exactly where she always seemed to be found, seated on a flat gray stone above the Pack's lodge with a view clear down to the water, as though she had been carved there along with the cliff itself. Bevan did not need to be told much. She took one look at the pendant swinging from Marin's fingers and went very still, the way she had gone still weeks before at the sound of Marin's humming, and when she spoke her voice had none of its usual dry edge. I wondered, Bevan said, when the tune came back to us, whether the blood had come back with it, or only the ghost of a song with nowhere left to live. I am glad, child, and I am sorry both at once, for what I must tell you. She told it plainly, without softening, because that was Bevan's way, and because, she said, Marin had earned the truth by the courage of having sought it out herself rather than waiting to be told. The moon curse unraveling the young ones, and now, slowly, dangerously, working its way toward the Alpha himself, was no sickness of blood or bone that any ordinary healer's craft could touch. It was grief, old and patient and vast as the sea that carried it, the tide mourning a promise broken 3 generations back, reaching for the only voice that had ever been able to answer it and finding, instead, only silence, year after year after year, until the silence itself had become a wound the moon could not help but tear at. Your blood is the last of that line, Bevan said. Whatever we do, however hard we fight it with tooth and claw, we cannot outfight the sea's sorrow. Only a tide witch's voice can. Only yours now, in all this wide green world. Marin looked down at the pendant, at its silver-veined spirals catching the gray morning light, and felt the weight of it settle into her the way the debt to the harbor master had once settled. Except this debt, she understood with a slow, dawning ache, was not one she could simply grind herbs late enough into the night to pay off. It was a debt owed by blood to the sea itself, and it had waited 3 generations for her to be born to answer it. Then I will have to learn the words, she said, and was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded, even as her heart beat fast and frightened beneath it. Whatever they are, wherever they're hidden. Bevan's weathered face softened into something almost like tenderness. They are not hidden, she said. They were never written down. They live in the part of you that hums without knowing why. You have been singing them all your life, child. You have simply never yet dared to let them mean what they mean. Below them the sea went on breaking against the rocks, patient as it had always been, patient as it would go on being until someone answered it, and Maren closed her hand around the pendant and felt, for the first time since she had found it, that the tide was not merely watching her. It was waiting for her to come home. Chapter 8. The harbor master's letter came on a gray morning, delivered by his youngest clerk with a wax seal so fresh it still smelled of tallow, and Maren knew before she broke it that it would not be kind. She read it twice, standing in her own doorway, the wind off the water tugging at the paper as though the sea itself wanted a look, and by the second reading her hands had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the wind at all. Every coin of her mother's debt called due within the fortnight, not the slow grinding payments she had made for years, herb by herb, hour by hour, but the whole weight of it at once, more silver than she had ever held in her life, more than the cottage and its garden and every jar on her shelves could fetch if she sold them all before the tide turned twice. She found old Nell Harrow, who kept the harbor master's books when his own eyes grew tired, waiting at the gate with an apology folded so deep into her face it looked like grief. "He says you've gone and given your labor to the wolves on the cliff," Nell said, not quite meeting Maren's eyes. "Says a debt owed to him ought to be paid in service to him, not to strangers in the trees. Says if you can spare hours to walk among wild things, you can spare hours to grind his salt cod cure, and since you haven't, he'll have his silver instead. All of it, now." "I have never once missed a payment," Maren said, and heard the tremor she could not quite keep from her own voice. "I know it," Nell said, "but knowing it and telling him so are different arts, child, and he isn't a man who wants to be told anything these days. There's more to it besides. He's been asking questions about the cliffs, about lights up there at night, and howling that doesn't sound quite like any wolf he's ever hunted. I'd watch myself if I were you, and watch who sees you walking that path." Maren stood a long while after Nell had gone, the letter trembling faintly in her fingers, and understood with a sick, plunging clarity that the harbor master had found the one lever in all the world that could move her, and had set both hands to it at once. Pay, and she would have nothing left to keep her grandmother fed and warm through the coming winter. Refuse, and lose the cottage that was the only roof her grandmother had ever known, in the only village she had ever called home. And beneath both, unspoken but plain as a blade laid on the table, the threat that if she did not bend, he would go looking harder for what walked the cliffs above Thistlewick, and he would not go looking gently. She did not tell Torrin at once. She told herself it was because there was no time, with the debt letter demanding her attention and her grandmother needing her broth and her herbs needing tending before the frost took them. But the truth, when she let herself feel its shape, was smaller and more frightened than that. She did not know, yet, how to hand him a danger that came from her own village, born of her own family's old debts, without feeling that she had brought the wolf to her own door twice over. It was Torrin who came to her, in the end, drawn by whatever thread of the bond told him something in her had gone tight and quiet, and he found her in the garden at dusk with the letter still folded in her apron pocket like a stone she could not put down. She told him everything. The silver, the fortnight, Nell's warning about lights on the cliff, and howls that did not sound quite like ordinary wolves. She watched his jaw harden by degrees as she spoke, watched the gold of his eyes darken the way it did when his wolf pressed close beneath his skin, and when she finished he was quiet long enough that she feared she had already lost something between them she did not know how to name. "He would expose us," Torrin said at last. "To force silver from a healer he has already bled dry for years. That is the whole of his courage, then. Threatening women and children instead of wolves." "He is frightened," Maren said, though she did not fully believe her own defense of him. "Frightened men reach for whatever weapon is nearest, and you would still speak gently of him." I would still try to understand him because understanding him is the only door I can see toward changing his mind. I have grown up in his ledgers, Torin. I know the shape of him better than you do. They did not raise their voices, not truly, but something had crept into the space between them that had never lived there before, a small cold current beneath the warmth, and it frightened Maren far more than the harbor master's letter had. That current found its true edge 2 days later, when Torin brought her again beyond the tree line to sit with Bevand over the vow song, and found Cormac waiting in the lodge clearing with several of the younger wolves gathered loosely behind him, his arms crossed, his handsome face arranged into an expression of grave and reasonable concern that Maren distrusted on sight. "There is word in the village," Cormac said, before Torin had even finished crossing the clearing, "that the harbor master means to hunt for wolves on this cliff. Word that came, I am told, because the healer's debts have made her interesting to him in ways she was not interesting before." He let that settle, watching Maren with eyes that were not unkind. Exactly. Only careful, the way one might watch a stranger's dog to see which way it would jump. I do not say she meant it. I say only that danger has followed her to our door twice now, and a pack that survives by staying hidden cannot afford to keep opening that door merely because its alpha is fond of the hand that opens it. "Say what you mean plainly, Cormac," Torin said low. "I mean that she is human and bound to a human town by human debts, and those debts have teeth we did not choose and cannot control. I mean that old Bevan teaches her the vow song while the rest of us are asked to trust a stranger with the oldest secret we keep, on the strength of a bond none of us can see, and a tune none of us has heard sung to its true end. I mean," and here his voice gentled, which was somehow worse than if it had sharpened, "that I love this pack too well to watch it gamble everything on hope alone. Torin. Even yours." Maren felt the old, familiar ache rise in her. The outsider's ache she had carried her whole life in Thistlewick and had thought, foolishly, she had finally begun to leave behind among the wolves. She looked to Torin, waiting for the swift denial she needed, and saw instead the smallest hesitation cross his face before he spoke, no longer than a held breath, but she saw it, and it lodged in her like a splinter too small to find and too deep to ignore. "She is not the danger," Torin said. "The harbor master is the danger. Maren has done nothing but try to save children who are not even her own kind." "I did not say she meant harm," Cormac said gently. "I said harm has followed her. There is a difference, and it is the only difference that will matter if the harbor master's men come up this cliff with torches." No one answered him. The younger wolves shifted where they stood, not quite meeting Maren's eyes, and she understood, with a hollow drop in her chest, that some part of them had already begun to wonder the same thing, quietly, in the private rooms of their own hearts, whether the healer who had wandered so gently into their lives might yet be the crack through which the whole careful secrecy of Duskfong came undone. Torin walked her back to the tree line himself that evening, his hand finding hers in the dark the way it always did, but something in the grip had gone careful, deliberate, as though he were holding not just her hand, but his own doubt at bay by main force. At the boundary stones he stopped, and looked at her for a long moment in the failing light, gold eyes searching her face for something she could not name. "I do not doubt you," he said, and she heard how badly he wanted it to be entirely true. "But you wonder," she said softly, "whether loving me was the mistake that will cost your pack everything." He did not answer, and his silence, gentle as it was, said more than any words could have, and Maren walked the rest of the way home alone beneath a sky gone starless with cloud, the harbor master's letter still folded against her heart like a second, colder debt, and wondered, for the first time since the storm had washed a wounded wolf into her garden, whether the tide, she carried in her blood had come to save the people she loved, or only to prove, once and for all, that she would always stand somewhere between two shores, belonging fully to neither. Chapter 9. The tide moon came up out of the sea like something poured, not risen, spilling molten silver across the water until the whole bay seemed to burn cold, and Maren felt it before she saw it, a pressure behind her breastbone that had nothing to do with breath. She had felt the pull of ordinary full moons before, faint and far off, a hum at the edge of hearing. This was different. This was the hum turned to a shout, and it dragged her out of her grandmother's cottage and down the cliff path with her shawl still loose about her shoulders and her heart going hard enough to hurt. She had meant to go to Torin first, to tell him what old Bevan had confirmed only that afternoon, that the pendant was no mere keepsake but a key, that the vow song was real and hers to sing, and that she believed. She truly believed. She could end this before the night was through. She had meant to say it gently, to mend the careful distance that had crept between them since the boundary stones. But the moon would not wait for her intentions, and neither, it turned out, would the curse. She heard the shore before she reached it. Not the ordinary hush and drag of water on stone, but something raw beneath it, a sound of young throats caught between growl and sob. And when she came around the last shoulder of rock into the cove where the pack had gathered to wait out the tide together, safety in numbers, safety in Torin's steady presence, she stopped dead, one hand flying to her mouth. The pups were down, not sleeping, not resting, but thrown flat against the wet sand in postures no living creature would choose, limbs jerking, half-shifted bodies twisting between fur and skin, as though something under the surface of them were trying to tear its way out through the wrong door. A boy no older than 10 summers in wolf years lay with his spine arched unnaturally, silver fur patched with bare human skin at the shoulder, whimpering in a voice too small for the great racking shudders that moved through him. Around the writhing young ones, older wolves paced and howled, helpless, some of them beginning to shake with the same fever, and Maren understood in one cold sweep of horror that the curse was not choosing its victims by age tonight. It was choosing by the size of the tide. And the tide tonight had no equal in living memory. Torin. She was running before she decided to run, skirts fisted in both hands, sand dragging at her boots, and she found him at the center of it, on his knees at the waterline, and her heart nearly stopped at the sight of him. He was neither man nor wolf. His shoulders had gone broad and furred, his hands curling into something between claw and fist, but his face was still his own, still Torin, jaw clenched, gold eyes rolled half back with the effort of holding himself together, and when he looked at her she saw, for one unbearable moment, that he did not know her. Torin. She dropped to the sand in front of him, took his changing face between her two ordinary human hands, and felt him shudder at her touch the way he always had, some deep animal recognition cutting through the fog, and for a heartbeat his eyes cleared. I am here. I am here. Do you hear me? I am not leaving you. Get back, he ground out, voice a wreck of gravel and something underneath it that was not speech at all. Maren, get the pups back. Get everyone back. I cannot. I don't know how long I... He did not finish. His whole body convulsed, and the golden light went out of his eyes like a lamp guttering, and what looked back at her then was wide and wild, and did not know her name.
No.
She said it like a command to the sea itself. No, not yet, not you, not tonight. It was Cormac's voice that answered her, close behind, smooth as poured oil even here, even now. You see the cost of your kindness, healer. He stood a little apart from the chaos, arms folded, watching his alpha thrash in the sand with an expression that might have passed to someone who did not know to look for grief. Maren knew better. Beneath the grief was something patient and pleased. The pack cannot be led by a beast tonight. Someone must hold it together while he is lost to himself.
You mean you, she said.
I mean whoever the pack will follow, Cormac said, and turned from her to raise his voice over the moaning wind and the thrashing young, calling to the wolves still upright, still clear-headed enough to hear him, that Torin had failed them, that the human woman's meddling had failed them, that only strength, his strength, would see them through the night. Some of the pack turned toward him, fear made hard, quick converts, and Merrin watched with rising dread as loyalty she had thought unshakable began, here and there, to waver. She had no time to fight him with words. She had a pendant cold against her collarbone and a song she had never been taught and did not know if she could trust, and she turned from Cormac's rising voice back to the water, to the great bright wound of moonlight lying across it, and began, with shaking hands, to reach for the clasp at her throat. That was when she heard the horses. They came along the headland path from the village side, torches guttering orange and wrong against all that cold silver, and even before she made out faces Merrin knew the shapes of them, knew the harbour master's crest stitched crooked onto the lead rider's coat, knew from the set of shoulders and the number of lanterns that this was no debt-collecting errand after dark. Someone had talked, or someone had watched too closely, and the village had come at last to see for itself what strange business drew its healer to the cliffs by moonlight. They were between her and the only path back down to the cove that did not require passing directly beneath their torches. She had walked out here in half a fever of purpose, thinking only of Torin, of the pendant, of the song, and had not once considered that the two dooms circling her life this fortnight, wolves and men, curse and debt, might close their jaws on the very same hour. Merrin Larkspur, the harbour master himself, called down, his voice carrying thin and triumphant over the wind, and she heard in it the particular relish of a man who believes he has finally caught a thing he has long suspected. Come away from those animals now, girl, and bring your debt book with you, or by morning the whole village will know exactly what manner of creature you've been keeping company with. Behind her the pups screamed again, a sound that cut through her worse than any threat from the cliff top, and Torin's ragged, half-formed voice rose with them. Lost, searching, calling for something he no longer had words to name. Cormac's voice rode over it all, smoother, surer, already reshaping the pack's fear into obedience to himself. Merrin stood at the narrow hinge between the torches above and the tide below, the pendant biting cold into her closed fist, and understood with a clarity that felt almost like calm that there was no more time left to be careful, no more time to choose the safer shore. Whatever she was, healer or tide witch's daughter, debtor or beloved, she would have to be all of it at once, tonight, or lose everything by morning. Chapter 10. The path up from the tide line had never seemed so long, nor the storm so eager to keep her from it. Merrin went anyway, skirts snatched at by wind and thornbrush, breath tearing ragged in her chest, the harbour master's voice still ringing behind her like a bell she refused to answer. Let him shout. Let the whole village hear. There would be a morning to face the wreckage of her name in, if there was a morning at all, and that depended on what happened in the next few minutes on the black sand below, not on anything she said to a man clutching a debt book on a cliff. She reached the last switchback and looked down, and her heart nearly failed her. The shore was chaos. Young wolves thrashed at the titterline, half-shifted and screaming in throats that could not decide whether they belonged to boy or beast. Their eyes rolled white with the same lost frenzy she had first seen in Torin's on the night he came bleeding into her garden. Torin himself was down on one knee near the rocks, his big body caught mid-change, for rippling up his forearms and receding and rising again, a man drowning in his own shape. And moving among the pack with terrible calm was Cormac, tall and dry-eyed amid the panic, already gathering the frightened elders to him with soft, reasonable words about what must be done now, who must lead, since the Alpha so plainly could not. Marin's hand closed hard around the pendant until its edges bit her palm. The old vow song rose in her before she had decided to sing it, the way it always had, wordless and low, the tune her grandmother had hummed over her cradle and called only a fisherman's habit, the tune that had made the tide pause outside her window 100 nights without her ever once wondering why. She stopped wondering now. She went down the last stretch of path at a run, half falling, and did not stop when her feet hit wet sand, and did not stop when old Bevan's white head turned toward her out of the dark with an expression too complicated for fear or hope alone. She walked straight into the boiling edge of the sea, cold water dragging at her skirts, and lifted her voice. It did not feel like singing. It felt like remembering, the way a hand remembers a door latch in the dark, the way a tongue remembers a name it has not spoken in years. The melody came up out of some place beneath thought, beneath even her mother's face, a place that belonged to blood and salt and grandmothers long drowned in time, and Marin let it come, unashamed, though her voice shook and the wind tried to take it from her. For one terrible moment nothing happened at all. The pups still screamed. Cormac's voice did not falter. Somewhere above, the harbormaster called her name a second time, sharper now, as if her silence to him were its own kind of confession. Then the tide answered. It did not crash toward her the way a wave crashes. It rose, smooth and deliberate as a held breath let out slow, curling up around her ankles and climbing no higher, as though the whole sea had leaned in close to listen. The moon-silvered foam gathered pale light along its edge, and where it touched the frenzied wolves nearest the water, their thrashing eased, small, then more, a shudder running out of clenched jaws and knotted spines like a fever breaking. Sing, rasped old Bevan, close behind her now, wading in without hesitation despite her age, despite the cold. Child, whatever that is, don't you dare stop. Marin didn't. She let the tune widen, opened her throat to it the way she had never dared with her hymns at market or her hums over the mortar and pestle, and the pendant in her fist grew warm despite the cold water soaking her wrist, warm as a coal banked all night and only now allowed to breathe. One by one the young wolves nearest her stilled, sides heaving, eyes clearing from white-rimmed panic into something drowsy and human-soft, pups again, frightened children instead of feral things, crawling toward the arms of packmates who caught them up and held them and wept without shame into damp fur. Cormac's smooth voice cracked for the first time. "It's a trick," he said, too loud, rounding on the elders he had been gathering to him. "A human trick, nothing more. Don't let her." "Look at them," Bevan said, and her voice carried the way a struck bell carries, effortless, final. "Look at your Alpha's pack, Cormac, calming before your eyes, and tell me again whose hand is steadying this shore tonight. Yours has done nothing this whole cursed hour but reach for what wasn't offered you." A murmur moved through the wolves still capable of understanding it, and it was not in Cormac's favor. Marin felt it without turning to watch, felt the tide of the pack's trust shift under her song the way the literal tide had shifted under her feet, and she did not stop singing to see it happen. She fixed her eyes instead on Torin, still locked in his half-shape by the rocks, fur and skin fighting for him like two hands wrestling over a single heart. She waded closer, the sea parting soft and warm around her knees, and let the melody bend toward him alone, the way it had bent toward nothing and no one in all her life until the night he first stumbled bleeding into her garden, and something in her had simply known him. Torin. She did not stop the tune to say it. She wove his name into the song's turning, The only word she let herself add to the old wordless vow, because some things could not wait for verses. Torin, come back. I have you. Come back to me. For a long, dreadful moment, he did not. His head thrashed, throat working around a sound too broken to be either wolf's cry or man's, and the last of the moon-cursed script showed in the way his claws dug white-knuckled runnels into the wet sand. Then, through the wind and the wolves' quieting whimpers and the harbor master's fading, furious shouting on the cliff above, he heard her. She saw it happen, saw the exact moment recognition broke through the fever like sunlight through storm rack, his head lifting, his golden eyes finding her across the churn of tide and torchlight and finding, in her face, in her voice, in the pendant glowing faint gold against her wet palm, something steadier than the curse's pull. His shudders slowed. The fur along his arms smoothed back into skin, inch by shaking inch, until he knelt there whole and human and gasping on the sand, chest heaving, eyes never once leaving hers. Marin let the song taper, note by note, the way a tide draws back without ever truly leaving the shore, until only the ordinary hush of waves remained, and the small broken sounds of a pack remembering how to breathe. Torin rose unsteadily and crossed the wet sand to her, and when he reached her he did not speak at first, only pressed his forehead to hers, both of them soaked and trembling and alive, while behind them old Bevan turned to face the scattering knot of elders who had, moments ago, been ready to follow Cormac into whatever ruin his ambition promised, and began, in a voice that allowed no argument, to speak of loyalty, and of what the pack had just watched with its own eyes. You came, Torin said against her hair, hoarse, disbelieving, as though he still could not quite trust the shape of his own returned mind. Through the storm, past him. A glance up toward the cliff, where the harbor master's shouting had gone thin and uncertain against the sudden, unmistakable evidence of a wolf pack made whole again beneath a gentled sea. I couldn't lose the shore twice in one life, Marin said, and found she was laughing unsteadily, salt water and tears both on her face. Not the sea, and not you. Above them, cut off mid-threat, the harbor master had gone very quiet indeed. Chapter 11. The storm was already breaking apart by the time the pack gathered on the shore, torn clouds sliding back from a moon so full and so close that it seemed to have come down to sit among them, silvering the wet sand and the wolves' rain-slick fur and the salt-stiffened tangle of Marin's hair. No one had told the pack to gather. They simply had, the way water finds the low place in the land, drawn together in a loose, watchful circle around Torin and Marin and the dark, receding line of the sea, as though some old instinct in every one of them recognized that something was ending and something else beginning, and none of them wanted to miss the hinge between the two. Old Bevan came first through the press of bodies, her gray braid unraveled by wind and rain, favoring one hit the way she did when a long day sat hard in her bones, and yet her voice, when she spoke, held none of the fatigue. Let him finish saying it then, she said, to no one and everyone, and stepped back to leave a clear space around Torin as though she were clearing an altar. Torin lifted his head from where it had rested against Marin's, and for a moment he only looked at her, golden eyes gone soft and stunned in the moonlight, a man newly returned to the shape of his own thoughts and testing, still, whether they would hold. Then he turned, slowly, to face his pack, and did not let go of her hand. Some of you have known for weeks, he said, and his voice, though rough with the night's ordeal, carried the way an alpha's voice was meant to carry, reaching the youngest pup crouched trembling at the circle's edge as easily as it reached Bevan. That I went to her in secret, that I brought a healer from the village into pack business, against the old caution, because I was afraid, and because nothing else had worked. He drew a breath that shook only a little. "I want it said plainly now, where there is no more secret to keep. Marin Larkspur is not merely a healer who did the pack a kindness tonight. She is the reason any of us are standing on our own 2 feet, or 4 paws, at all. She is my fated mate. I have known it since her hands first closed a wound of mine in her grandmother's kitchen, and I was too much a coward, and too proud of my own fear, to say it where you could all hear." A murmur went through the gathered wolves, not quite disbelief, not quite surprise, more the settling of something many of them had already half-sensed and never dared name aloud, the way a held breath finally goes out of a body. Somewhere near the back a young wolf, one of the very pups who had thrashed and howled on this same sand not an hour before, gave a thin, exhausted yip that might almost have been approval. Marin felt the weight of all those eyes and did not look away from them, though her heart hammered as hard as it had at the height of her run down the cliff path. She had spent so many years learning to make herself small in rooms where she did not belong, folding herself into corners of the harbor master's ledger and her grandmother's failing house, that some old animal part of her still braced for the circle to close against her rather than around her. But Torrin's hand was warm and sure in hers, and when she made herself meet old Bavan's gaze, she found in the elder's face not suspicion but something almost like relief, worn soft at the edges by years of waiting for a debt she had never expected to see repaid in her lifetime. "There is more to say than that, Alpha," Bavan said, and came forward again, leaning on her stick, until she stood before Marin the way she had stood before her on the first day Marin had walked, terrified, past the tree line into Duskfong land. "This pack does not simply gain a healer tonight, or a mate for its alpha, welcome as both are. It gains back what it lost 3 generations ago, when a frightened woman took her daughter and her fear and fled a coast that had asked too much of her." She lifted the pendant that still hung, salt-crusted and gleaming faintly, at Marin's throat, not touching it, only looking, the way one might look at a relic returned at last to its proper shrine. "I told you once that the sea does not forget its promises," Bavan said. "It does not forget the ones who make them, either. You are the last daughter of the Tide Witch line that stood at this shore before any of us wore fur, Marin Larkspur, and tonight you sang the vow song back into the water with your own blood-remembered voice and asked nothing for yourself in the singing of it. That is not a debt discharged. That is a line renewed. I name you, before this pack, Tide Daughter and Vow Keeper, and welcome you home to a shore that has been waiting 3 generations to have you back." The words moved through the gathered wolves like wind through the seagrass, and one by one, first the elders and then the younger ones, they bent their heads to her, not the wary, sidelong deference she had grown used to over these past weeks as a guest tolerated for Torrin's sake, but something whole and freely given, pack to pack, kin to kin. Marin felt her throat close around something too large for words, and did not try to speak past it. She only pressed her hand flat over the pendant at her chest, over the place beneath it where her heart still beat too fast, and let herself, for the first time in her life, be looked at and found to belong. It was into that hush that a new voice cut, thin and furious and entirely out of place beneath the moon's calm. "This is madness. Witch tales and moonlight, and you'd have me believe." The harbor master had picked his way down the last of the cliff path with 2 of his men at his back, his lantern guttering uselessly now that the storm had passed and the moon lit the beach bright as noon, and he stopped short at the edge of the pack circle, all his bluster faltering as it met 100 quiet, steady eyes turned toward him at once. Torrin's men did not need to threaten him. They only had to stand, healed and whole and unafraid, where an hour before he had expected to find them raving. It was Marin who walked to meet him, not Torrin, and something in her bearing, some new stillness she had not owned before tonight, made even the harbor master go quiet as she approached. "You came to collect a debt and to spread ruin on wolves you don't understand," she said, not unkindly, only plainly, the way she might have once explained a fever to a frightened mother. "Look at your own harbor. Look at what the tide would have done to Thistlewick tonight, storm-swollen and wild, if there had been no one left to sing it calm. You have had that keeping all these years and never known to thank it. I am not leaving the debt unpaid, and I am not leaving my grandmother unguarded, and I am not leaving this shore either. All three are mine to hold now. You may choose to see that as trouble, or you may choose to see that your village is safer for it than it has ever been. But there is no more secret here for you to sell, and no more girl here for you to press small." He looked at her for a long moment, at the pendant, at the wolves ranged quiet and unafraid behind her, at the moon-washed sea gentled to nothing more than a soft, ordinary hush upon the sand, and whatever calculation had driven him down the cliff path guttered out of him, like his lantern flame. He turned without another word and climbed back toward the village, his men trailing silent behind him, and did not look back. It was much later, when the pack had begun, in twos and threes, to drift back toward the warm lights of the lodge, that Maren found her grandmother waiting at the tree line, wrapped in every blanket the cottage owned, and leaning on the arm of a young dusk-fawn wolf who had half carried her down from the village the moment word reached him. Her grandmother's eyes were wet, and her hands, when she caught Maren's face between them, trembled with something that was not illness. "I always knew the sea loved you more than it ought to love an ordinary girl," she said, laughing and weeping at once. "Your mother was a fool to run from what you were born for.
Go on, then.
Go and be happy, child. Let an old woman see it before she goes." And beneath the calm, wide moon, with Torrin's hand finding hers again and the tide breathing soft and easy against the shore, Maren let herself, at last, believe that she could. Chapter 12. The moon that rose over Thistlewick that autumn evening was the kind Maren's grandmother used to call a lamp moon, full and low and gold as good butter, hung so close above the water that it seemed a person might reach up from the cliff path and warm their hands at it. Maren stood at the very edge of the bluff where she had stood so many times before, first as a girl with salt-cracked knuckles and a debt she did not choose, then as a healer with her basket of herbs and her worries, and now, 3 seasons past the night the tide had risen to her voice, as something she had never let herself imagine being. She smoothed her hands down the front of the pale blue dress old Bavan's daughters had sewn for her, its hem embroidered along the edge with a thread of silver that caught the moonlight like foam, and she breathed in the wind coming up off the water, brine and kelp and the green smell of the gorse that had gone gold and rattling with the turn of the year. Behind her, the cottage was not the cottage she remembered. The old lean-to roof that had leaked onto her grandmother's cot every hard rain was gone, replaced by good slate the pack had carried down from the high quarry beyond their territory, plank by plank, laughing the whole while about how a healer ought not to have to set a bucket under her own bed. The single room had become 3, and where her mother's dried herbs had once hung crowded and jumbled from every beam, there was now a proper drying rack Torrin had built with his own hands, wide enough that Maren no longer had to choose between comfrey and coltsfoot when both needed the same rafter. A wolf-carved lintel arched the new doorway that connected the healer's house to the covered walk leading toward the tree line and the lodge beyond, so that the boundary she had once crossed in fear, ducking under branches with her heart hammering, was now simply a path she walked every day, sometimes twice, sometimes with a basket of salve for a pup's scraped knee, sometimes with nothing in her hands at all, only the wanting to be where Torrin was. She heard him before she saw him, the particular soft weight of his footsteps on packed earth that she had learned to know from 100 others, and then his arms came around her from behind, his chin settling atop her head, and the low hum that had once startled her in her chest now simply steadied, the way her own heartbeat steadied when he was near, as if it had always been keeping time with him and only now had someone to answer. "They are gathering," he said against her hair. "Bevan sent me to fetch you before you talk yourself into believing you are not ready." "I am ready." She turned in the circle of his arms to look up at him, at the golden eyes that had gone soft as candlelight the moment he found her that first night bleeding in her garden, at the silver now threading faintly through his dark hair at the temples, more than there had been a year past, though he wore it, she thought, like a man wears a good coat, easily, without complaint. "I have been ready. I think I have been ready since before I knew what I was ready for." He laughed, the sound rumbling warm through his chest into hers, and pressed a kiss to her forehead before taking her hand, weaving his fingers through hers the unhurried way he always did, as though he had all the time there was and meant to spend every bit of it exactly like this. They walked the covered path together into dusk fawn territory, and the forest that had once seemed to Maren a wall of shadow and low growls now opened before her the way a home opens before someone returning to it after a long day. Lanterns hung low in the branches, real flame and something warmer besides, a soft gold light the pack's old magic lent to festival nights, and beneath them the clearing before the lodge had filled with more wolves and wolfkin than Maren could easily count, some in their two-legged shapes in good autumn wool, some loping easily on four legs between the trestle tables, tails high, noses lifted to the smell of the roasting root vegetables and the honeyed bread the pack women had been baking since dawn. Children who had once, months ago, watched her from behind their mother's skirts with wide, uncertain eyes now ran to catch at her skirts themselves, tugging her down to show her a hollow acorn or an especially fine snail shell, utterly unbothered by the fact that Maren Larkspur had no fur and no fangs and could not, however she tried, catch a scent on the wind the way they could. She was simply Maren, healer, Torrin's mate, Bevan's Tide Witch daughter come home. She belonged to them in whatever way the pack understood belonging, which she had come to learn was not a matter of birth at all, but of who stayed and who was stayed for. Old Bevan found her near the fire pit, leaning on her carved stick, her sharp eyes bright beneath heavy brows, and took Maren's face between two dry, warm hands the way Maren's own grandmother liked to do, as if reading a book written only in the plains of her cheeks. "The sea is quiet tonight," Bevan said. "Truly quiet, girl. Not merely resting. Do you feel it?" Maren did. She had felt it building for months, ever since the night of the highest tide moon, a slow unclenching, like a fist she had not known was closed finally opening finger by finger. The old grief that had lived in the water since her great-grandmother turned her back on the vow, that had curled itself into the moon curse and set young wolves thrashing and feral on the sand, had gone, night by night, gentler. Some evenings now, when she walked the Titterline alone and hummed the wordless song without meaning to, the water only sighed against the rocks the way any ordinary sea might, content, unhaunted, glad simply to be tide and nothing more. "I feel it," she said. "It isn't grieving anymore." "No," Bevan agreed, and something in her weathered face sees too, an old debt of her own finally paid. It has been a long while waiting for someone willing to sing to it instead of running from it. Your line ran 100 years. You did not. That is no small thing, child, whatever you think of yourself. Then Cormac's cousin, who had taken up much of the beta's old duties since Cormac had been sent from the pack that terrible dawn and not seen since, called the gathering to order, and the wolves and their kin drew into a wide ring around the fire, and Torrin came to stand beside her with his hand warm and sure around hers. The ceremony itself was simple, as pack things so often were, no great pomp, only truth spoken plainly under an open sky. Torrin spoke the old words of the mating bond, words Maren had heard him practice under his breath for a week beforehand, though he pretended otherwise, and when it came her turn she found she did not need her own prepared words at all, because what rose in her instead was the old wordless tune, the one that had followed her all her life without a name, and she let it go up into the night exactly as it wished to be sung. And the pack around her hummed low in answer, 100 throats joining A. Melody none of them had been taught, as though it lived in the marrow of Duskfang the same way it lived in her blood. The moon hung full and warm above them all, and far below at the foot of the cliffs the sea kept easy time with the singing, rising and falling, without a trace of the old ache in it now, only the ordinary, endless faithfulness of water that loves the shore and always, always comes home. When the song ended, Torrin drew her close beneath that moon, and the pack's joy rose up around them like warmth from the fire, and Maren, who had spent so many cold nights believing herself made wrong for any place she stood in, understood at last, deep and quiet as the turning tide, that she was exactly where she had always been meant to be, and that she was, for the whole of her life to come, no longer anyone's outsider at all. The end. Thank you for listening to the Salt-Moon Vow. If you enjoyed this story, a new full-length audiobook in the Moonlit Bonds series arrives every week. Until next time, good night.